may have a seat. I want to invite you to open with me to Genesis chapter 22. Genesis 22. I'm going to give you a moment to get there and just say thank you to everyone who came to the Dollar Car Wash and helped out yesterday. It was awesome. It was probably, one of the, just most solid car washes we've had, I think. They were just, we were lined up with cars the whole time. In fact, we even closed, like we were done. There was no more signs on the corner, and the cars just kept coming. And people were just really appreciative of it. As you guys know, it's a dollar car wash with a little bit of a surprise at the end because we don't charge them $1. We actually give them $1 after we wash their car. And there was a woman who came through, and she was so excited by what happened that she tagged us on Facebook. She went and found us on Facebook, and then she said this on Facebook. She said, in a world that can sometimes seem upside down and self-focused at times, along comes this beautiful little church doing this amazing $1 car wash with a twist at the Des Moines Community Playhouse today. Thank you, Table Church. You've restored my faith in humanity, and you are truly lovely people. That's what it's all about. So thank you so much to everyone that came and served with us. What a fun way to bless our community. And we certainly will be doing more of that in the future. And also, of course, we had to grab our, I don't know if the picture's been up there yet. Okay, well, it's our annual tradition of the Kevin Andrews selfie arm picture. So it was a good time. So Genesis chapter 22, we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 14 today. And I need to confess something to you. There's a question in Genesis. Something's funny, and there's an inside joke happening. It reminds me of Michael Scott's line. What's he say? An inside joke, huh? I love inside jokes. I've always wanted to be a part of one. Or I hope to be a part of one someday, yeah. So anyway, carry on with your inside jokes. Genesis chapter 22 is a passage. There's a question in here. We're doing a series called Questions in Genesis. And we're looking at the questions in Genesis. Well, there's a question in this chapter that I've actually avoided. In fact, I was planning not to talk about this one because it's really hard. And I didn't want to preach a sermon on this passage because I didn't know what to say, honestly. And so I skipped it. I went over this passage. I got to Jacob last week. And this question has just kind of continued to haunt me. This passage has haunted me. And I felt like God was saying, Phil, you need to preach on this one. Don't just skip this one. Just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And so I went back and wrote a sermon on this particular passage. And so yes, we're out of chronological order in Genesis. We did Jacob last week. Now we're going backwards, and we're going to talk about Abraham again. But that's okay. So here we go. Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When they had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. Here's our question for today. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." So the question of whether God exists is obviously a very important question. But I'll confess something to you. As I've gotten older, I find myself growing a bit less interested in that question. Not because I don't think it's important, but you know how the first time you ride a merry-go-round in your life, it's just a thrill, and then you get a little older and it's a little bit less exciting? Well, I've been on that merry-go-round a lot of times in my life. And so maybe it's a little bit less exciting than it once was. But the other thing is that honestly, to me, God is just not only logically necessary, but experientially real. And so you might say that I've kind of cooled on that question a little bit. And it seems to me that our culture, we've kind of seen the same thing happen there too. A few decades ago, 15 or 20 years ago, the question of whether God exists was raging in our culture. There were atheists publishing New York Times best-selling books. They were going on speaking tours, convincing as many people as they could that it's silly to believe in God. And these speaking tours, they achieved a level of celebrity rivaled only by rock stars. It was a huge cultural phenomenon. Well, all of that's gone away, and many of the leading atheists from that season have kind of retreated into the background of cultural memory. In fact, Richard Dawkins, probably the most notorious of them all, recently referred to himself as a cultural Christian. Now, what he's saying here is not that he believes in the doctrines of Christianity. He's saying that he has come to appreciate what Christianity means and represents in the ways that it's shaped his culture. It's really hard to believe that Richard Dawkins would have said that 20 years ago. It's an important question. Does God exist? But I actually wonder, one reason why it seems to kind of lose steam after a while is because that question is not enough. In fact, it really gets us nowhere if all we ask is, does God exist, yes or no? Because you must also ask the follow-up question, well, if he does exist, what kind of God are we talking about here? That matters, doesn't it? Now that's a question that I'm very interested in. What kind of God are we talking about here? A.W. Tozer said that what we believe about God is the most important thing about us. What he's saying is that your life is shaped by what you believe God to be. Your theology determines your lifestyle. At a previous church that I worked at, there was a young couple who came to me and asked me to dedicate their baby. And I said, of course, I'd love to. A few days later, I got a call from the baby's grandma, and she was crying on the phone because she is terrified. She was terrified that if we dedicated her grandson, instead of baptizing him, that if something happened to him and he died, that he wouldn't make it to heaven. And so we had a conversation about this. And by the way, we do baptize infants here at Table Church. We just baptized Everett Heemstra a few weeks ago. But whenever someone is deciding between baptism or dedication, and I'm happy to do either, but when we're talking about infant dedication, I'm always very clear, look, this is not what saves you. Baptism doesn't save you. We're saved through faith in Christ. But what baptism is it's a sign of God's love for us. It's a sign of welcome into the people of God. It's also a means of grace where we can be transformed, but it doesn't save us. And I explained this to the grandma, and I also said, that's just not the kind of God I believe in. The kind of God who would lock the doors of salvation simply because an infant's parents didn't decide to baptize him. That's not the kind of God I believe in. I don't think it's the kind of God that we mean in Scripture either. But it's what she had been taught her entire life. Look, the Bible does not try to answer the question of whether or not God exists, at least not very much. Pretty much assumes that answer from the very first sentence. Instead, it is an extended answer to the question, what kind of God are we talking about here? What kind of God are we talking about here? And listen, it is hard to find a story that cuts to the heart of that question more than the story that we're talking about today. It's come to be known as the binding of Isaac. Now, for 10 chapters in Genesis leading up to this point, we've been reading through the Abraham narrative, all of its twists and turns and the roller coaster of up and down. And Abraham's kind of all over the map sometimes, but there's been one constant through the story, and that has been God's promise. God has promised Abraham to make him into a great nation. And not only that, he's going to do it through his son Isaac, whom was born to Abraham through his wife Sarah. All of these things Abraham doubted. They at times tried to take matters into their own hands and help God out a little bit on the things that he said he would do. But God comes and says, no, you will have a son through Sarah. And through him, you will become a great nation. Time and again, hope seems lost, and God comes and reiterates the promise. That's the one constant throughout Abraham's life. And God delivers on his promise. They're nearly 100 years old, and Isaac is born. The promise is being fulfilled. And now we've reached what we might call the climax of Abraham's story, and it takes this sudden, surprising, and dark turn. Verse 2, then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Let's appreciate the narrator of Genesis here for a second. He's just like kind of twisting the knife with this fourfold repetition. Your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Take him and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. As we dig into this passage, I want us to remember that as modern city folks, like most of us are, we tend to take for granted things like the rainy season coming when it's supposed to. Maybe not take for granted, but just not think of it at all. We don't really worry about the rains coming when they're supposed to, right? It's not a concern for us. There's going to be water coming on my faucet no matter what. I mean, the biggest inconvenience for me is like, I don't get to water my lawn as much. Darn. That's not how it is for a lot of people in history and a lot of people in the world today. In fact, we recently got an email from our sister church in Zambia, Poetis, and they're going through the worst drought in Zambia in 100 years. I was just talking to Caitlin. She just was there for 6 weeks doing their intensive. And she said that normally they get 3 months of rain in the rainy season. They got like 3 days of rain last year. And so things are very, very tough in Zambia right now. And so they're doing this thing called load shedding. Load shedding is where the country basically rations electricity to you. And so they sent this email to their partners and said, look, we're without power for about 12 hours a day right now because of load shedding. And what's more is there's these hand pumps, water pumps in our village, and several of them are broken. And so they're reaching out saying, hey, we would love for some donations so that we can fix these hand pumps. And so Table Church sent them $500. If you want to donate to Poetis, you sure can. Write a check. We'll get it to them. But the reason why they were going through such problems with their power is because Zambia is largely powered by hydroelectric power. And, of course, when there's no rain, there's no hydroelectric power either. And so pray for Zambia and pray for Poetis. But the reason I bring that up is because, look, it's easy for us to forget that we rely on weather for our survival. And when it doesn't cooperate, what do? Well, you pray. And if that doesn't work, you sacrifice. And if that doesn't work, well, that's when many people in history have started to think, well, let's see, I sacrificed the best of my flock. What's up from there? And that's how we get to child sacrifice. And so this is something that we know happened in the ancient world. Because look, when your God is hungry, bloodthirsty, angry, vengeful, it's either the survival of your people or not. There was one god in the ancient world named Molech, and it's clear that Molech demanded this, or at least in the minds, right, of his people. He demanded this of them. And the temptation to do it was apparently big enough that the Bible has to explicitly tell Israel not to do it. Leviticus 18:21, do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Look, archaeologists have found the bones of children mixed in with the bones of animals in ancient ritualistic sacrificial sites. Because for many people, when you've got a God who's angry, this is just how you survive. Now, like I said, this story, it leads us to ask the question, what kind of God are we talking about here? And here's the point I'm trying to make. Look, we read this story and we ask, what kind of God would ask a man to sacrifice his son? Ancient people would ask, what kind of God doesn't? It's a dreadful scene for anybody, but it's a little less surprising for an ancient person. They might think, well, this God Yahweh, not so different than Molech after all, I guess. And so Abraham loads the donkey, he gets Isaac and his servants, and they set off, and they go on a 3-day journey. And once he sees the mountain, he leaves the donkey, he leaves the servants, and he just takes Isaac. And as he goes, he makes this curious statement. He says to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Now, what do we mean by this "we" here, Abraham? We will come back to you. You know that there's no "we" that's coming back. So why do you say this? Why does Abraham say that? Well, there's two options. Either option one, Abraham was lying. He just didn't want Isaac to run away, or he didn't want his servants to stop him or something. He's not going to say, yeah, well, I'm going to go here sacrifice my son, and then I'll be back. He's not going to say that, right? So maybe he's lying. But there's a second option. Option number 2 is that Abraham actually does think they will both come back. That he trusts that God will not ultimately require this of him. And so he's simply telling the truth. Because remember, throughout this story, throughout this narrative, the lesson that God has been trying to teach Abraham is not to simply blindly obey me when I tell you to do something, Abraham. It's that he's been trying to get Abraham to trust his character, to come to know what kind of God he is. And maybe it's that Abraham, in this moment, the climax of his story, has finally learned the lesson. That Abraham finally knows what kind of God Yahweh is, and he knows Yahweh is not the kind of God who would require this of him. He is not Molech, he is Yahweh, and so we will return to you. With option number 2, God is not necessarily testing Abraham's ability to just blindly obey him. He's testing whether or not he really trusts him. I think that option 2 is reinforced in the text. It goes on in verse 7. Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. Here's our question. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. Now again, we have the question, why would he say that God will provide a lamb? Is this a lie? Is it a metaphor? Yes, son, God will provide a lamb for our offering. Guess who's the lamb? Is that what's going on? Or does he actually think God's going to provide a lamb? Now, perhaps Abraham trusted God even though he had absolutely no clue what God was up to. Could it be that he really did believe that God would provide a lamb for him? That all of this time, as he didn't believe that God would actually give him a son, and then God did, that he wouldn't then turn around and take the son away. Now, the narrator of Genesis doesn't tell us what's going on inside of Abraham's head. Kind of leaves it up to us to think about. I mean, of course, we see what Abraham says, and maybe that's an insight into it. But again, you could interpret it multiple ways, right? Well, fast forward a few hundred years, get to the New Testament. The writer of Hebrews is asking the same question. I think he was trying to figure out what was going on in Abraham's head here as well. And here he has this moment, Hebrews 11, he says this, Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. I don't I don't know exactly what Hebrews means here, but what it does seem to say is that the writer of Hebrews also believed that Abraham knew he'd get his son back. That he knew he would be coming back down the mountain with Isaac. Seems to suggest to me that Abraham, deep in his heart, knew that God wasn't going to take Isaac from him. And what this means is that what we see in Abraham, it's not blind robotic obedience. That's not who Abraham was anyway. Abraham's a dude that argues with God. He bargains with God. He doesn't trust God. He tries to help God out. I mean, it's hard to believe that now that the son that he's been promised finally is here, he's going to be like, sacrifice your son. Okay. I'm not going to do that. That's not the Abraham we meet in Genesis. But maybe what it is that Abraham has finally learned the actual lesson he's been trying to be taught by God this whole time, and that you can trust him, that he is good, that he's not like these other gods, that that's what kind of God he is. And so I suspect that this story is to be read as like the culmination of Abraham's character arc. It wasn't that he finally learned to be quiet and do what he's told us, that he's finally learned what kind of God Yahweh is. He knew deep in his heart both he and Isaac would return. That's why he said it. He really did believe that God would provide a lamb for the sacrifice. That's why he said it. He didn't know when, and he didn't know how. He probably couldn't figure out what was going on, but he knew who God was. Here's what we can take from this. The only way to learn what God is really like is to trust him when it doesn't make sense. Abraham and Isaac journey for 3 days. They build an altar, put the wood on it. Abraham even binds Isaac to it, reaches for his knife. And just when it looks like Molech 2.0, the angel says, Abraham, Abraham, do not lay a hand on the boy. Now remember, for you and me, the surprise is that God would ask him to sacrifice his son. For many in the ancient audience, the surprise is that God would stop him. It's showing us what kind of God this is, and it's not Molech. What we learn in this story is that God isn't hungry. He's not angry. He's not vengeful. He's not bloodthirsty. He's not like the other gods. But listen, what else we learn? The only way to find that out is to trust him when it doesn't make sense. That's when you find out what kind of God we're talking about here. It's in the hard times where you learn somebody's character. Look, you and I, we don't cast God in the image of Molech anymore. It's not a temptation for us to say, maybe this is what God is like. That's not as much of a temptation anymore. You know what we do? We cast God in the image of ourselves now. Ancient people expected their gods to offend them. Modern people expect him not to. We cast God in our own image today. And so if God were to ask us to sacrifice something, I wonder if it would be our comfort, our wealth, our ideals. I wonder if it would be more along those lines today. And he would say the same thing that he wanted to say to Abraham. He'd say, look, do you trust me more than that stuff or not? Do you trust me that I'm actually as good as I say I am or not? Abraham finally trusted. God is good. We will return. God will provide a lamb. God has defeated Molech for us today, but he hasn't defeated any of those other gods yet. The gods of wealth and comfort and pleasure and all those other things. Because it's easy to trust God when things are going fine, but what about when God calls us to do something that goes against the way of the world? And thousands of people are shouting one thing and God is whispering another. Do we trust him then? Because listen, trust that quits the moment it's actually required isn't really trust. Like the moment that you quit because you can't see the outcome means there was never trust in the first place. Trust, by definition, requires you not to know what's going on to a certain amount, to a certain degree. My son, Rowan, many of you know, he's 7 years old. He and I like to play chess, and we've become chess nerds together, and he's in a chess club, and we'll play online and stuff like that. And one day he was playing a game of chess online, and I was looking over his shoulder doing the typical annoying dad stuff like, I don't know, what'd you do that for? That sort of stuff. And so he had this move where his opponent was attacking his knight. That's the horse. And he was going to make a move, and he moved, and he didn't move his knight. He just left it there. And I was about to say, hey, man, you just hung your knight. And before I could say it, he looks over his shoulder and goes, I know what I did. Trust me. And sure enough, he attacked his opponent's king with his bishop, so he had to block, and he got that piece, and then he had to block again, and he got that piece. He got 2 pieces for the price of 1. And see, I didn't see the whole picture. Rowan did. And I had to trust Rowan in that moment that he knew what he was doing. For some 10 chapters, God has been trying to get Abraham to trust him, trying to get him to show, look, I've got the whole picture, all right? Like, I understand what I'm doing here. The question is, do you actually trust me to keep my promises? And it seems that Abraham finally does. He finally does. God will provide a lamb. He said it, and my conviction is that that's what he thought. That's what he believed. And sure enough, verse 13, Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Look, God is not just testing Abraham's obedience. He's testing his trust. Like, do you think that I'm actually the kind of God that I say I am? A God who loves you. A God who wants what's best for you. Do you know that that is the hardest thing to believe? It is comparatively easy to believe that God exists, but to believe that God is actually good, that he actually wants your best, and that you can actually trust him with your life, that's very hard. That takes a lifetime of discipleship. That's really why we're doing all of this. You can believe that God exists, great. That might not change anything about you until you answer the question, what kind of God are we talking about here? Can I trust this God? Does he want what's best for me? Will following his ways actually lead to life? Even when the world is screaming another thing, but God is whispering this, doing this, will it actually lead to me thriving, even when it doesn't look like it will? Do I trust him? That's what's hard. Some of us here today are in a confusing time, and here's what I want you to know. You don't have to doubt God's character. Doubt yourself. Doubt culture. I don't think that we humans are as smart as we think we are. Don't doubt God. Trust God's ways, because only by trusting God in the difficult times do we actually see what God is like. And that's a beautiful place to be. But it requires that moment, that gap where we kind of go out over the edge of the cliff and we don't know how we're gonna land, and God has to catch us. That's when we find out who God is. Early on in the church, we launched this church around 5 years ago, and early on, something I didn't see coming happened. Our worship leader came to me and said that he was going to quit. He was done leading worship for the church, and that was a rough morning. It was a breakfast appointment, and not what I was hoping to hear. We're still in a stage where it's like, is this church going to survive or not, right? Well, I also had on my calendar that day a lunch appointment with somebody I'd never met yet. He had just started coming to the church. His name is Jay Erickson. And so I went from breakfast with that news to lunch with this new guy, Jay. Turns out he tells me he's a worship leader. And I'm like, God, what are you doing? What are you doing to me here? And one thing led to another, and here we are. And it was in one of those moments where God just told me, Phil, you're riddled with anxieties and worries about this church and about survival and everything. Can you trust me? Can you trust that as long as you're doing what I call you to do, I've got this thing? That's just one of many moments like that, maybe the most pronounced moment like that, but it's one of many where God has shown me, you know what? You actually can trust me. Like, I know preachers say that all the time. No, it's like real. I was like, wow, God, that's amazing. And of course, one day, another son would climb another mountain and would be bound to some wood as a sacrifice. And of course, this time, the executioner's hand would not be stopped, but Jesus would die as a sacrifice for our sins. And this would be the greatest display of what God is like, that we have a God whose love for us goes beyond anything we can possibly comprehend, a God who loves us so much that even eternity could not separate us from him, but he is willing to come not only to earth, not only as a human, but to the very bottom of existence, to take on the nature of a slave and to be obedient unto death, even death on a cross. That's what kind of God that we have here. And so in a way, we know more than Abraham. Abraham didn't know anything about Jesus at this point, but we have a very clear picture now. We can answer the question, what kind of God are we talking about here? We can look at Jesus. That's the kind of God we're talking about here. And he could not be any more different from all the other gods that we worship. So we know what God is like. The question is, do we believe it? Do we trust him? Are you willing to surrender that confusing thing, that heavy burden, that difficult thing where you don't know what to do? You're feeling your heart pulled this way, but you know God is calling you over here. Are you willing to trust him with that for real? And so we're going to sing one last song, and as we do that, we'll make it just a moment of surrender. Would you stand with me for a second? And feel free to just close your eyes. And I'm going to hold out my hands like this before the Lord. I invite you to do the same if you'd like. And today my suspicion is more than a few of us have a circumstance that's very difficult or confusing, something in which you're tempted like Abraham to take matters into your own hands, or maybe you're just tempted to panic. I walk away from that breakfast panicking. God, what are we going to do? Can we just take a moment and just let God say, hey, I got you. You can trust me with that, and just hand that circumstance over to him and say, God, I'm going to follow you in this. I'm going to trust you in this. I'm going to trust that you're going to provide a lamb. I don't know how yet, but that's why you're God and I'm not. You don't find out who God really is until you trust him when it doesn't make sense. And so that's what we're committing to do right now. God, when we say trust God, I'm not saying that you get to just go do whatever you want and expect God to, hold up his end of the bargain. I'm saying that we're going to surrender our lives to him. We're going to live lives of holiness before him, and we're going to see the incredible thing that he does for us. And so, God, we surrender to you now all the difficult things and the confusing things, all these circumstances where we're tempted not to live out your ways, but God, we commit ourselves to you right now. We're going to follow your path. We're going to do as you call us to. And we're going to trust, Lord, that you have something up your sleeve that we can't even see right now. And when you do that, when we finally see it, even if it's at the 11th hour, God, we're going to give you the glory. Because that's what kind of God you are. Thank you, God, that it seems like every page in Genesis you're trying to show us, look, I'm not like Moloch, I'm not like Baal, I'm not like these other gods. I am Yahweh, and I love you. We love you too. Amen. Just sing with us now.